The wind cracked against Levi's cheek, like a slap from something ancient. He'd been in plenty of storms before overseas in dry valleys back home in canyon winters, but this one felt personal. Angry, the kind of storm that didn't just push, it judged. He stood beneath a skeletal pine, its branches stripped raw, the bark peeling in curls. Fog crawled up from the gulch below, and the sky sagged under a heavy bruise of clouds. The trail he'd been following since mid-morning had vanished behind him, swallowed by weather and silence. Somewhere above, thunder rolled low and slow like a warning grumble from a bear not yet seen. Levi squinted against the cold needles of rain that had begun to fall, not in drops, but slanted lashes. The map in his vest pocket was no good now, too wet and thin to even unfold. He didn't need it anymore. There was no trail. The forest had changed shape behind his back as if deciding he wasn't welcome after all. His boots sank slightly into the moss-heavy ground. He adjusted his pack straps and rotated his left shoulder, which had been aching since dawn. Old injury, shrapnel, they said. He figured it was just one more reason not to sit too still for too long. 3 miles in, maybe 4, he muttered to himself. His voice was rough, barely above the wind. It didn't matter. No one could hear him out here. And that was the point. He had come to these woods to be alone, not lost. There was a difference. Ever since the discharge papers were signed honorable with notes about conduct and years of service, Levi had been drifting. Not from place to place, but from meaning. His sister had called it a transition. His cousin Goose called it retirement. He called it quiet panic. Days that stretched wide but said nothing. Nights spent staring at the ceiling in a house too modern, too wired, too flat. So he'd come back to the Bitterroot, the land his grandfather had taught him to walk as a boy. The old Salish trails, the ones not found on tourist maps. Ones his family used to follow when the leaves changed and the sky came closer. He didn't want visions. He just wanted space. Now that space was pressing back. A gust pushed through the treetops, and Levi turned instinctively to brace for the next wave of wind. That's when he saw it. Not far ahead, maybe 30 yards, something broke the line of trees. Not a boulder, not a thicket. There were lines to it. Geometry. He stepped forward slowly, his instincts coiled. Part of his mind ticked back to patrols, reading shapes in the sand, distinguishing trash from threat. But this wasn't foreign. It was a shape he recognized from stories and old trail markers, the ribs of a covered wagon. Levi narrowed his eyes and moved forward, boots sinking into sodden moss. As he stepped closer, the form came into focus. It wasn't just a wagon. It was more. The frame had been built up, logs added, shaped, interlocked. A roof had been extended, reinforced. Someone had taken a mobile shell and made it permanent. He circled it carefully, every movement silent. The wheels were mostly buried now, moss crawling up the spokes. A young spruce leaned against one side as if trying to claim it. The forest had been working to erase it, but hadn't yet won. He came around to the front, where a low-pitched overhang shielded what had once been the entry flap. There was a proper door now. Heavy wood iron braced, closed. He reached out, hand hovering inches from the latch. The instinct to knock came and went. Something about it felt sacred, or maybe just forgotten. He'd seen buildings abandoned in Iraq and in backwoods Kentucky. This wasn't that. This wasn't dereliction. This was choice. Someone had built this to stay and then hadn't stayed. Lightning flared silently through the clouds, casting a sharp white over the scene. Thunder followed, late, distant, but moving. He had maybe 20 minutes before the real storm hit. He had a choice: go back into trees that were turning to shadows, and risk the cold swallowing his trail completely, or step inside a place that didn't belong to him but had clearly once saved someone else. The handle was cold beneath his fingers. He turned it. The door groaned as it swung open but didn't resist. The hinges were weathered but solid. Levi stepped inside. Dry air greeted him like an old memory. It smelled of pine pitch wood smoke and something softer wool, maybe. The cabin was dark, but not dead. Shelves lined one wall, carefully built. A narrow bunk jutted from the far side. At the center sat a squat iron stove, its pipe vanishing through the roof above. Levi stood just inside the door, dripping. He let it close behind him, slowly, quietly, as if waking someone. Then he exhaled. It had held, all this time. This shelter wagon turned cabin movement turned stillness had endured. He unshouldered his pack and set it down near the wall, shrugged off his jacket. His breath steamed in the still air. The silence inside was thicker than outside. It wasn't just quiet. It was listening. He approached the stove and knelt beside it. The door swung open easily, inside ash, old gray, fine as dust. Someone had kept this burning. Years ago, maybe a century, but not carelessly. This stove had been cleaned, tended. It had been used with respect. He closed the door and sat back on his heels, the wood floor creaking beneath him. For a long moment, Levi said nothing. He just listened to the sound of the wind outside growing stronger, racing down the mountain, like it had a name and a job to do. He wasn't out of danger, not yet. But something in his chest had loosened. Not because he was safe, but because something about this place said you made it this far. Now listen. Then just as he reached into his pack for his emergency fire starter, he saw the marks carved lightly into the wood beside the stove. A series of notations. Small. Precise. He leaned in closer. They weren't random. They were instructions. The last one read, "Keep the lower vent half closed if wind rides from the south. She'll draw clean that way." Levi sat back. Someone had left behind more than shelter. They'd left memory etched in wood. He struck a spark. A man knows when he's lost. He just doesn't always admit it before the rain starts falling sideways. Levi pressed both palms against the inside of the wagon door, listening. The wind hadn't died down. It had changed pitch, less like movement, more like challenge. It yanked at the trees with sudden fists, then stepped back and waited to see what stayed standing. He turned away from the door and toward the stove. The fire he'd lit was burning low, but steady, just enough heat to chase the ache out of his bones. A soft amber glow touched the curved ceiling of the wagon cabin, sending faint shadows across the iron stovepipe and the worn bench against the far wall. He remembered how it felt the moment he struck that first spark, half expectation, half apology. Not to the forest, not even to himself, but to whatever this place was. A thing built for endurance shouldn't be relit casually. Now warmth spread outward in quiet pulses. The stove's design was efficient, small, but not cramped, set dead center with just enough clearance. The heat didn't blast. It radiated, rising gently, and then drifting outward like steam from a good mug. The room had stopped feeling like a box and started feeling like a decision. Levi's eyes traced the carvings near the vent again. They weren't just notes. They were evidence. Proof of care. Someone had lived here long enough to notice the wind. Long enough to write down how to live with it. He set his pack down properly and unzipped it in the firelight. Pulled out his thermal blanket water pouch and a tightly wrapped bundle of food. Dehydrated meat, dried corn, some hard biscuits. His fingers moved automatically, training and repetition. but his mind stayed on the notches in the wood. They reminded him of briefing walls overseas where the mission plans were mapped in marker. One wrong arrow, one bad line, and men didn't come back. So you wrote clearly. You erased what didn't work. You annotated what did. A mark on a surface was how you remembered things the body might forget under stress. Levi took the meat between his teeth and chewed in silence. The fire cracked once sharp but clean. The walls didn't creak. The wagon was tight. Solid. He finished eating and wrapped his blanket over his shoulders, sitting on the bench with his back to the wall. His boots rested near the stove, steam curling up from their seams. He leaned his head back and stared upward. That's when he noticed it. Above the stove, carved high on one of the inner beams almost hidden in the grain, was another marking smaller, older. It wasn't a sentence. Just a name. Elias. The wood around it had darkened over time, but the name had been gouged in deep. Purposeful, not decoration. Identification. Levi sat up straighter. Elias. That wasn't the kind of name you left lightly. He stood and walked over to the stove again. He touched the name lightly, then stepped back and scanned the rest of the ceiling. More faint marks followed, curving slightly with the roof. Lines like a tally or measurements. Below them on the wall near the bunk, more names. Faded, spaced out. He traced one slowly, Lene. Another Toma. Children, maybe. Family. This wasn't a one-man shelter. This was a home. Temporary or not, it had been lived in. Levi swallowed the dryness in his throat and crouched beside the stove again, tilting his head until he could see beneath it. The ash drawer sat snug in its slot. He slid it out. Inside, only a thin layer of gray dust. No chunks of half-burnt wood. Just fine, compacted ash, like someone had cleaned it regularly. Like someone had meant to use it again. He tapped the edge of the drawer and watched the ash break apart and float slightly. It was dry. Completely. Which meant the flue pipe was still intact. Not clogged. Not rusted through. That shouldn't be possible, not after 100 years. Unless... Levi pushed the drawer back in and stood heart-thudding faster now. He looked again at the small carvings, the names, the marks, the notes. This cabin wasn't just preserved by accident. It had been built right, maintained. Someone knew what they were doing. And then they were gone. The fire popped softly. He walked to the door and cracked it open. A cold blast hit him square in the chest, hard enough to steal his breath. The clearing outside was nearly dark. Rain came in slanted sheets, now cutting sideways through the trees. A tall pine near the left side of the clearing creaked under its own weight. No trails were visible anymore. Even the indent his boots had made were gone, dissolved into the sponge of the forest floor. He pushed the door closed again and slid the wooden latch down tight. Turning back into the room, he pulled his blanket tighter and sat again. 100 thoughts moved through him. Logistics, trail markers, weather shifts, elevation. But they weren't loud thoughts. They were smooth, grounded. The truth was, he wasn't going anywhere tonight. The forest had taken that option off the table, and he wasn't afraid, just alert. Because the more he looked around the cabin, the more convinced he became that someone had been in this same position before. Stranded, waiting. Listening to wind push through the trees like an animal pacing outside the circle of firelight. But that man Elias, he hadn't panicked. He had measured things. He had carved names. He had stayed. Levi stretched his legs out and let the heat settle back into his joints. Something deep inside a knot he didn't know was still tied began to loosen. He'd never meant to find this place. Never meant to stumble into someone else's memory. He had just come to walk until the silence grew comfortable again. Now he wasn't alone in it. Not really. His eyes landed on the shelf just above the bunk. There, tucked into the corner, was a bundle wrapped in old twine. It hadn't been there when he first came in, or maybe he just hadn't noticed. He stood slowly, crossed the room, and pulled it down. It was light, cloth-wrapped, fragile. He set it gently on the small fold-down table and unraveled it. Inside pages. Faded, curled at the edges. Ink bleeding at some corners, but still legible. He turned the first one over and saw the handwriting. It was careful, small, unhurried. At the top was a name, Elias II Elk. Levi stared at the name, then at the stove, then back at the letter. The forest outside shook its fists against the roof, but inside, the storm had changed shape. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was an invitation. It wasn't falling apart. It was waiting like it knew someone would come looking. Levi turned the pages slowly, the brittle paper whispering beneath his fingers. The handwriting was steady, if slightly slanted, the kind a man would use when space was tight and ink was precious. It wasn't meant for an audience. It wasn't storytelling. It was record-keeping, like coordinates etched into memory, so they wouldn't be lost when bodies broke down and the mind wore thin. October 17th, 1889. We've stopped for the season. Can't risk going farther. Linné's coughing again. Toma sleeps through most days now. The wagon won't carry us across the pass before snow hits. This will be where we winter. I will make the wagon stay. Levi sat back in the creaking bench blanket still draped over his shoulders. The fire in the stove cracked gently, filling the room with heat and a faint scent of pine tar. Outside, the storm continued pushing and pulling at the structure, but the wagon didn't budge. It was rooted now, like it had grown here. He looked around with new eyes. The walls hadn't been built in panic. They'd been added with skill. The seams were tight, the joints fitted without gaps. Whoever Elias was, he'd known how to use his hands. Levi had seen makeshift shelters in the desert, hasty rigs in the mountains, tents stitched with duct tape, shipping containers repurposed with desperation. But this place wasn't desperate. It was deliberate. The wagon had been converted, not just parked, not just covered, but transformed. Beams were pinned into the original frame, expanding the space. The stovepipe had been cut through the roof at a precise angle to avoid leaks. Even the shelves were symmetrical. It wasn't a shelter. It was a statement. He stood and walked the perimeter of the small interior, his boots muffled by a layer of woven mat beneath his feet. That, too, hadn't been random. It was bark cloth, layered and dried soft enough to quiet movement, used often in old Salish camps for insulation and silence. Near the rear wall, he found something else, a row of shallow pegs, each smoothed with age. One still held a strip of leather, brittle now, but clearly once used to hang something, tools maybe, or satchels. A careful man organized his space when he intended to stay. Levi turned back toward the bunk, eyes falling on the shelf where the letters had been tucked. He reached up and pressed lightly against the upper panel. It gave slightly. He tested the other wall sections, nothing hidden, just the same sense of intention behind every board. It hit him then fully with the weight of truth. This was a place that had been waiting, not accidentally preserved by time, but built to endure it. The fire snapped sharply behind him. Levi turned and crouched beside the stove again. He tapped the ash drawer, watching the puff of dust lift and drift, then reached into his pack for his tin mug and poured in a little water. Set it on the stove to warm. He read more as steam curled upward. November 3rd. Finished the reinforcement. Added the crossbeams. We're losing sun earlier every day. Toma doesn't speak much. Lene wants me to write things down, says it will matter. Maybe not to me, but someone. I told her no one would ever find this place. She just smiled and said, then write it for the trees. Levi exhaled through his nose. He knew what it meant to write for something that couldn't talk back. The wind hit harder just then, rattling the stovepipe for the first time. But it didn't shake the walls. The structure held. Levi listened closely, one hand resting on the edge of the bench, the other still near the letters. The trees outside moaned and cracked. Pine cones hit the ground with tiny thuds. A branch snapped in the distance, clean and loud. Then silence, like the forest had paused to take stock. He poured steaming water into a small pouch of coffee grounds and let it sit. The smell filled the room, mingling with fire smoke and old wood. Familiar scents, grounding ones. His eyes drifted again to the stove. He couldn't stop looking at it. It wasn't modern, not by 100 years, but it was crafted with precision. The stove body was iron, its doors reinforced, the latch still snug. The air vents were positioned not just for heat, but for safety. And the flue was routed with care, elevated, braced, and angled, so smoke didn't back up even in high wind. This was more than frontier ingenuity. It was engineering passed down through generations, made from what was available. Levi could see the logic in it, like reading another veteran's mission notes left behind, not out of ego, but necessity. He reached for the next page. November 22nd. Snow came early. Lene's fever worsened. I reinforced the hatch. If the drift buries the wagon, we'll outlast it. I wrote my name in the beam tonight. Stupid, maybe. But I want the wood to remember me. Levi looked up at the ceiling again and saw it anew. That beam held more than a name, it held presence. A man writing himself into the bones of a place because the world might not remember otherwise. He stood suddenly and crossed to the door again. This time he opened it wider. Rain had turned to sleet. Thin slivers of ice ticked across the clearing. The tree line swayed, but the storm had shifted direction. It was no longer howling, it was breathing low, steady. He stepped out just enough to glance up. The clearing was still there, the same shape he'd memorized, but it looked different now, less wild. He could almost see it, how it had been, smoke curling from the pipe, snow packed up against the sides. Firelight flickering through chinks in the wood. A man, a woman, a child, trying to survive something bigger than themselves. He stepped back inside and shut the door. The letters remained where he left them, waiting. He stirred the coals, gently added another log, then unfolded his sleeping pad and settled it near the bench. Before he lay down, he lifted one of the floorboards beside the bunk just to see. It shifted slightly under pressure. That was no accident. He ran his fingers along the edge and felt a notch, not a break, a handle. He stopped, closed it again. He would wait for morning. For now, the fire held. The storm hadn't broken the cabin. It hadn't broken him either. He lay back, eyes on the ceiling where the name Elias waited like a watchman. He didn't know what he'd find under the floor, but he knew it wouldn't be empty. Nothing about this place had been so far. The fire didn't just warm him. It remembered someone else's hands. The embers still glowed in the belly of the stove, their light steady and soft, not yet dimmed by the long night. Levi sat up slowly, one hand against the small of his back, the other reaching toward the heat. His body protested, stiff from sleeping on the hard surface near the bench. But he'd slept. That was rare enough to mean something. Outside, the storm had quieted to a steady patter. The sleet had turned back to rain sometime in the early hours. He could hear the drops now hitting the roof in rhythms broken only by the occasional groan of a burdened branch. The wagon cabin hadn't shifted. It hadn't leaked. It had simply held. He turned toward the spot near the bunk, the floorboard that had given slightly beneath his fingers the night before. The feeling hadn't left him. There was more to this place. More than the carved names, more than the letters tucked into shelves. Something had been left behind on purpose. He crouched, worked his fingers under the seam again, and gently lifted the panel. It came up smoother than expected, as if it had been lifted many times before worn in, just enough to make it easy for the hands that belonged to it. Beneath the board was a dry, narrow cavity lined with bark and canvas, a nest of sorts. He leaned closer and saw fabric bundles wrapped in faded cloth. Not debris, not trash. Preserved. He pulled one out and unwrapped it slowly. Inside, silver coins, dull but unmistakable. Next to them, a small leather pouch. He opened it and found simple jewelry turquoise set in hammered metal, a string of carved bone beads, and a ring worn thin at the edges. Not decorative, personal. He set them aside gently and reached again. Beneath the bundles were folded papers, yellowed and creased so thoroughly they were soft at the bends. Some had crumbled corners. He handled them carefully, spreading them out across the bench in the firelight. They were land documents, tribal, handwritten records of travel permits, trade notes, one folded sheet with a charcoal map of the area. Another had bold script across the top, letter of credit, Salish Confederated, 1888. He blinked hard, reading the fine lines. This wasn't junk. This was everything a man would keep to prove who he was, who he hoped to be, where he meant to go. And it had been left behind. Levi sat back slowly, the weight of the moment settling across his chest like a blanket not asked for. These weren't things someone forgot. These were things you set aside for safekeeping when you thought you'd come back for them. He turned to the letters again and selected one from the bottom of the bundle closest to the floor where the moisture hadn't touched. The ink had bled a little, but the writing was still legible. December 1st. Lene sleeps more now. Sometimes she wakes, asks me what I've built. I tell her it's not finished. She tells me to write anyway, says people remember houses but not the work that made them stand. I don't want to lose the trail, even if no one walks it again. The fire crackled behind him. Levi stood, letters in hand, and fed a few pieces of kindling into the stove. The heat flared again, the light rising with a soft hum. It touched every surface, now warming the cabin from floor to roof. He moved around, slowly absorbing it all. Each shelf had been placed with purpose. Each board fitted and sealed. Even the fold-down table where he'd laid the documents had brass hinges that, though dulled, still worked silently. No rust. No rot. He couldn't stop thinking about the hands that built this. The way they must have moved, firm, steady, calloused. Working in cold mornings and darker evenings, racing the weather, but refusing to rush. The stove radiated outward, wrapping the space in layered warmth like a memory passed through wood. Levi crouched beside it again and examined the flue pipe. Still drawing clean. No backdraft. The notes carved in the beam above had done their job. One of the carvings mentioned wind direction. He opened the door just slightly and stepped outside to test it. The sky had turned to a dull pewter, low and unmoving. Mist clung to the tops of the trees like wool. The clearing was soaked puddles, run-off channels cutting new veins through the soft ground. A large branch had fallen to the left of the structure, missing the wagon by a few feet. He looked at it longer than necessary. Had it landed just a little farther south, the roof might have cracked. The wagon's bones, though strong, weren't immortal. The forest still had teeth. He stepped back inside and shut the door gently. The warmth returned to him as soon as the latch clicked. The room accepted him again without question. He poured a little more water, ground some coffee between his palms, and watched the steam rise once more. Then he sat at the table, the documents laid out like offerings, and took his time reading them. Each line was a line back in time. One document included a note from a trade official, handwritten verifying ownership of certain goods and tools. Another page listed names and ages: Linnae, age 32, Toma, age 9. Next to them scribbled smaller 2 mules, 1 injured. He could see them now. Not just Elias. The whole family, moving westward, breaking down, making the choice to stay. Not out of surrender, but calculation. Winter forced their hand, and Elias answered with design. Levi ran his fingers over the last document, a sketched layout of the wagon's modifications. Measurements, angles, placement of the stove, notes on reinforcement beams. It wasn't just preservation. It was planning. It was hope drawn to scale. He leaned back against the bench, coffee and hand fire steady, and let the silence settle again. He didn't feel like a visitor anymore. He felt like a witness. That stirred something in him. Not obligation, not yet, but awareness. This place wasn't abandoned. It had been left behind like a message waiting for the right eyes. Levi took the documents and rewrapped them in fresh cloth from his pack, set them back into the hidden compartment, sealing it the way he'd found it. One hand lingered on the floorboard before he pressed it down. The warmth from the stove reached his back as he stood and faced the shelves again. A narrow wooden box caught his eye on the highest shelf. He pulled it down. Inside, a rusted tin of matches, some fragments of wax, a needle, 2 buttons, and a folded cloth with symbols stitched in red thread. Salish needlework. It was a mending kit, meant for long hauls, meant for repair. Levi held the cloth and stared at the flame dancing behind the stove's iron window. The fire hadn't just warmed him. It had remembered someone else's hands. He didn't write to be remembered, he wrote so someone else might survive. Levi's fingers curled around the next letter in the stack, the paper dry and curled at the edges, fragile as a leaf in late October. He sat at the small fold-down table, the fire behind him, steady, casting long shadows that flickered like ghosts against the wooden walls. The warmth in the cabin was complete, now settled deep into the grain, making even the old wood seem like it exhaled. He read silently, the words coming into focus in Elias's sharp, practical hand. December 10th. Storms hitting harder. Lost another beam to the pressure of snow. Rebuilt it with green spruce. Not ideal, but braced it tight. The stove's drawing clean now that I've sealed the vent at the base during wind. Toma asked me if we'll see spring. I told him yes. I told him it's already inside this place, we just have to wait long enough to let it out. Levi paused, eyes locked on that last line. Spring wasn't outside. It was inside. He looked up, gaze sweeping across the cabin again. It didn't feel like survival now, it felt like design. A structure born not out of fear, but of faith in the future in hands not yet born. A man had stayed here not just to live, but to leave something behind. The letters weren't journal entries. They were operating instructions, maps, quiet road signs scrawled in ink and judgment. He turned the page over and kept reading. December 18th. Linnae's fever broke, but the cough's worse. Toma helps me gather wood. He's growing thinner, but still smiles when I let him use the draw knife. I taught him to trim notches clean. Said someday he'll build better than me. He told me he'll build bigger. I laughed, but I believe him. A small smile touched Levi's lips. It was the kind of line men wrote with pride, too big to say out loud. Teaching a boy to hold tools, to understand them. Passing down more than knowledge, passing down a reason to use it. He reached across the table and pulled one of the thin logs from the woodpile beside the stove, turning it in his hands. There were cuts on it, old tool marks made with a hand axe or plane. Not factory, not store-bought, shaped with labor and time. The fire crackled as he slid the log into the stove, the wood catching with a faint hiss. A moment later, a steady hum of heat filled the room again. Levi stretched his legs, the stiffness from the previous day settling low in his back. The air inside had shifted, not just warmer but denser, held, as if the cabin had relearned its purpose through use. He pulled another letter from the bundle, one with a small red mark in the corner, likely from wax, maybe a seal. Elias's handwriting seemed shakier here, the strokes slightly rushed. January 3rd. Wolves came through last night, didn't get close. Toma heard them first. He said they sounded lonely, not hungry. Lene laughed. I did too. It helped. We're low on salt, but still have root flour and the dried elk. I check the beams each morning. The wagon holds. The wagon always holds. I still hear creaking in the night, but it's the trees, not the structure. It's strange, but I trust the walls now more than I trust the sky. Levi leaned back, letting the weight of that last sentence rest in his chest. He understood that trust. There were places, tents, bunkers, certain rooms on certain nights where you could believe in what surrounded you more than what you couldn't see. He remembered a foxhole in Kandahar, his buddy Clyde asleep beside him, the only light coming from a cigarette, and the moon above them. That feeling of being safer underground than anywhere above it. Now here, 100 years later, that same trust echoed in the grain of these walls. He folded the letter gently and returned it to the bundle. Then he reached down and opened the hidden floor panel again. The documents were still there, wrapped carefully as he'd left them. But something in him hesitated. He didn't want to just preserve them. He needed to understand what had come before. Not just to witness it, but to interpret it, carry it. He reached into the cavity and pulled the land deed back out. It was brittle, but whole. The seal at the bottom, faded but distinct, bore the mark of the tribal council from the 1880s. He turned it over and found a small note scribbled on the back in different handwriting, less precise, more flowing. Lene's, perhaps. If you find this, we made it through one winter. We hoped for more. Take only what you need. Leave the rest for the next. Levi stared at the words, heart knocking against his ribs. The next. It hadn't been written for a family member or even a friend. It had been written for a stranger, for whoever came after, for him. He sat in silence, the fire whispering behind him, the storm now barely a mist against the roof. The woods outside had quieted, not in surrender, but in watchfulness. He rose and moved to the door, pulling it open slowly. The clearing was silvered in dawn light. The fallen branch from the night before remained heavy with rain. Beyond it, the forest shimmered with wet bark and slow-moving fog. He stepped outside into the cold. His boots sank slightly into the softened ground. He scanned the perimeter tree lines, slope brush. Then he looked back at the wagon. From the outside, it was modest, faded, its roofline uneven from years of weight. The iron wheels half submerged, but now he didn't see where. He saw resilience, craft. He stepped closer and ran his hand along the outer beam just above the support post. It was slick with rain, but solid. The edge curved slightly where a hand plane had run over it, the cut smooth despite time. He leaned in, squinting, and saw another mark, a small one, almost invisible in the wood. It was a single line, then two slashes crossing through it. A builder's tally, like a soldier scratching days into concrete. Levi stepped back, breath rising in mist. He didn't smile. Not exactly. but something loosened behind his eyes. The letters, the stove, the coin, the notes, they weren't fragments. They were continuity. Someone had loved this place enough to shape it into safety, to leave it in readiness. Not just for themselves, not just for spring, but for whoever walked into it next. He turned toward the trees. No trail visible. The path in was gone, wiped clean by rain. He didn't feel anxious. The forest would reveal itself again, when it was ready. And when it did, he knew what he had to carry back. Not just the documents, but the story. He stepped back inside, shut the door behind him, and reached for the folded map among the papers. He wasn't the last chapter in this, just the one opening the book again. The land doesn't forget, only people do. Levi stood at the edge of the tree line, the morning sun slicing low through the Douglas firs, setting everything in gold. The forest felt different now, less like a wall and more like a veil. Beyond the mist, the mountains watched unmoved, but he didn't feel alone anymore. Not truly. He adjusted the strap of his rucksack, now packed with the folded letters, the deed, Elias's map, and a few of the tools from the cabin. He'd taken only what he needed, just as Lene had asked. A piece of jerky. The carved bone whistle. One of the brass buttons from Toma's old coat, stitched with black thread and a little worn around the edge. The wagon cabin stood behind him, warm and solid in the clearing. Smoke still curled from the stovepipe, but it would fade by noon. He'd banked the fire low, someone else might need it again. Someone else might find themselves lost like he had. He turned toward the east, boots squelching in the wet ground. The air smelled of thawed pine and early spring rot, the kind of scent that hinted at deer tracks and soil about to bloom. Levi scanned the slope, tracing the path Elias had marked nearly a century earlier, an old fur trade route that dipped toward the glacial basin. The handwriting had faded in spots, but the line remained. He moved carefully, following the faded map etched into his memory. Every fallen tree and ravine matched what had been drawn. It was uncanny, as if Elias had known someone would need more than words, as if he'd carved his hope into the very terrain. Half a mile down, the forest broke open. A ridge loomed ahead, and beyond it he caught the faint glint of water, Lake Coeur d'Alene wide, and still curled beneath the morning light. Levi squinted. That had to be the direction of the trailhead. With enough daylight and steady legs, he could make it to the tribal office in St. Marie's before nightfall. His chest tightened at the thought. Paper in his pack, or not, it was the story in his mouth that mattered. The land grant. The family's survival. The whisper of ancestors living on in pine beams and metal stoves. Would they believe him? Would they remember what the land had once promised? He pressed on, ducking under low branches and stepping across a stream that gurgled softly in the thaw. Each footfall was deliberate, but his mind spun faster than his boots could carry him. He thought of Elias's careful lettering, of Lene's hopeful note, of Toma's boyish pride in holding tools. A family built a refuge, Levi thought, and no one remembered. Not until now. But someone else had remembered someone living. That whistle hadn't blown itself. He paused near a wide cedar and touched the whistle in his coat pocket. The tone had been clear, purposeful, unmistakable. He kept walking. By midday, Levi reached the ridge. The forest opened again, and to the left, hidden beneath brush and snowmelt, he spotted the shape of a weathered fence post. He stepped closer and saw the wire, barbed, aged, drooping like it hadn't held a thing in decades. Beyond it, a clearing of churned soil and low brush stretched toward a wide gravel path where an ATV track cut fresh into the ground. Someone had been here recently. A sound stopped him. It wasn't wind. It wasn't birds. It was a low, mechanical hum, steady, deliberate. Levi crouched near the tree line and waited. A moment later, a figure crested the edge of the path riding a small green four-wheeler, a long tool strapped to the back. The man rode with ease, one hand on the throttle, the other cradling a thermos. As he drew closer, Levi recognized the face. Silas Brokenrope. Older now, gray threading his thick braid, but still built like the mountain itself. Levi hadn't seen him since they stood together outside the Tribal Resource Center after a wildfire evac drill 6 years ago. Levi stepped into the clearing and raised a hand. Silas slowed to a stop, staring for a beat before pulling off his gloves. "Well, I'll be damned," Silas said, voice low and steady. "I thought they said you left for good." "I thought I had," Levi answered. Silas climbed off the ATV and walked closer, boots crunching over frost-cracked gravel. "You look like you crawled out of the mountain." "I kinda did." They clasped hands, firm and knowing the way men do when they don't have time for small talk. "You're not out here by accident, are you?" Silas asked, nodding toward the ridge. "No." "Found something," Levi said, lowering his voice. "Found someone." Silas's eyes narrowed. Alive, not anymore. But they left a trail. A wagon cabin, old, intact. Silas tilted his head, curious. Names were Elias Linné, and a boy named Toma. Levi continued. Survived a brutal winter sometime in the late 19th century. They homesteaded on tribal land. There's a deed. Letters. Full trail mapped down to the basin. You ever hear about them? Silas shook his head slowly, expression hardening with the gravity of the moment. No stories passed about that family. But you know how it is. If it's not spoken, it fades. Levi reached into his pack and handed over one of the letters, the one about the wolves and the sky. Silas unfolded it, reading with the quiet attention of someone who understood what it meant to hold a legacy in his hands. After a long pause, Silas looked up. They were kin. Levi nodded. Looks that way. The deed's got the old council mark. And Linné wrote something on the back. Told whoever found it to take only what they needed. Silas handed the letter back, face unreadable. But Levi could see the shift in his eyes, some mix of reverence and sorrow. I'll take you to the council, Silas said, but they'll want to see everything. You ready for that? I'm not keeping any of it. That place, what they left, it belongs to the people. I just want them remembered. Silas looked at him again, longer this time, as if seeing the boy Levi used to be the one who ran barefoot through creeks and carried slingshots in his pocket. You've changed, Silas said. Some changes take time. Silas gestured to the back of the four-wheeler. Hop on. We'll ride down. Council meets at sunset. Levi climbed aboard his pack, thudding against the metal. As the engine roared to life, he glanced back once toward the ridge and the trees that had held him, taught him, remembered for him. The wind rushed past as they drove, the forest closing behind them. The story was leaving the woods, now returning home. I didn't come back to be a hero. I came back because the story was unfinished, and so was I. The low sun painted the horizon in copper and smoke as the four-wheeler rolled into the tribal grounds at St. Marie's. Dust curled behind the tires like a memory stirring awake. Levi squinted against the light, the brim of his weathered hat doing little to shade the ache in his eyes. The buildings ahead stood quiet, but solid red brick cedar beams and glass that caught the setting sun like mirrors of the past. Silas pulled to a stop outside the old resource lodge, cutting the engine with a soft click. A few people milled about the grounds, some tossing glances at the familiar stranger on the back of the ATV. One elder paused, leaning on a cane, studying Levi with quiet curiosity. Levi met his gaze briefly, then looked away. I'll get word to the council, Silas said. Give me a minute. Levi nodded, stepping off and adjusting his pack. His legs still carried the rhythm of the mountain's slow, deliberate alert to each noise. The sounds here were gentler, the creak of porch planks, the whistle of wind off the river, and the low murmur of children somewhere inside. He walked to the edge of the porch, boots thudding hollow on old wood, and sat. His hand drifted to the pack beside him, fingers brushing the outline of the letters, the map, the button. The weight of the story was heavier here, closer to people who had the right to hear it. The door behind him creaked open. He turned to see a woman in a slate-blue shawl step out. Her hair was streaked with silver braided over one shoulder. Her face was lined not with age but with depth, like river rock worn smooth. "You're the one Silas brought in from the mountain," she said, voice firm but not unkind. "I am. I'm Laurel Blacktail, council speaker this season." Levi stood, offering his hand. "Levi Ironhorse." She took his hand briefly. "You've stirred something, Levi. Silas says you found a cabin that shouldn't be there." "It's there," Levi said. "More than a cabin. It's a history sealed in snow and cedar." She looked him over, not like she didn't believe him, but like she was measuring weight, his, the stories, the truth between. "We're just waiting on Elias." Levi blinked. Elias Laurel smiled faintly. Elias Blacktail. Archivist, named after his grandfather. Levi's throat went dry. "So he knows the name, he doesn't know what it means yet. Maybe you're here to help him learn." Before Levi could speak, the door behind Laurel opened again. A young man, late 20s maybe, stepped through holding a small leather-bound journal. He had high cheekbones, warm eyes, and a quiet intensity about him. His walk had purpose but lacked pretense. "Laurel," he greeted. Then he noticed Levi. His brow furrowed slightly. Elias, Laurel said, stepping aside. "This is Levi Ironhorse. He's brought something we need to see." Elias nodded, setting the journal on the table beside the door. "Let's sit." They gathered in a circle around the lodge's hearth inside. The fire was low, barely more than a flicker. Levi pulled out the map first, unfolding it carefully on the table. The creases were sharp, the ink still legible despite its age. Elias leaned forward, tracing the route with his finger. "These old trail markers. They match the pre-state surveys." "Exactly," Levi said. "But this line, this was drawn by Elias." He tapped the name in the bottom corner. "Elias Blacktail, the first." Silas stepped in from outside, silent and watchful. Laurel gestured for Levi to continue. He laid the letters out next, smoothing each one gently like laying bandages over an old wound. They built a home after being turned away by every outpost from Spokane to Bitterroot. A winter shelter. The boy Toma called it the Wagon cabin, built from a broken-down freighter and scraps they dragged by hand. He spoke slowly, letting the room breathe with each word. Laurel read one letter aloud, her voice hushed. "We boiled pine needles for tea and scraped lichen off bark like it was butter. By the time the sun dipped fully below the horizon, every letter had been passed from hand to hand." Elias sat back stunned. "My great-grandfather wrote these," he whispered. "We didn't even know where he'd gone. Only rumors. That he vanished into the mountain and never came back." Levi reached into the side pocket of his pack and pulled out the bone whistle. The moment he placed it on the table, Elias stiffened. "I know this," he said. "My uncle carved one just like it when I was a boy. Said it was based on an old story about a call that could guide you home." "Someone blew this in the woods," Levi said low. "The day I almost turned back." No one spoke for a long moment. Laurel finally broke the silence. "So you're saying there's a direct bloodline link and a valid deed?" Levi nodded. "And a promise. Lene wrote it. Said whoever found it must share it, no more secrets buried in snow." Elias looked up at Levi. Why you? Why did you find it? I wasn't looking, Levi admitted. I was running. From grief, from war, from myself. But the land doesn't forget. Laurel stood. Then neither will we. She turned to Silas. Get the survey records and start a tribal land review. If this is authentic, we bring the wagon cabin back into the story, and we honor what was nearly lost. Elias looked down at the letters again, his fingers trembling. I want to go there. You should, Levi said. It's yours in more ways than one. Laurel placed a hand on Levi's shoulder, and Levi swallowed hard. I'll go with him. But after that, maybe I'll stay, help rebuild it. Maybe teach Toma's story to the next kids who get lost in that forest. Laurel's voice softened. Not lost, called home. The fire crackled behind them as night folded over the reservation. Outside, the trees swayed under stars that had watched everything unfold for over a century. Inside the lodge, history had found its voice again, carried not by monuments or museums, but by people willing to listen. And in that quiet, Levi felt the first stirrings of peace. Not the kind earned through silence, but the kind found when the story is finally finished aloud. And yet deep in the part of him still tied to the cabin, a flicker of unease remained. The bones had not yet spoken. Something buried was still waiting to rise. Even in silence, bones remember what the living forget. Snow clung to the last patches of earth like forgotten pages of a fading diary, as Levi, Elias, and Silas crested the ridge overlooking the wagon cabin. Morning mist curled around the treetops, casting the clearing in a cold hush, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Elias had barely spoken since they left St. Marie's before dawn. He carried the letters wrapped in oiled cloth, tucked against his chest, like sacred scripture. His face held a mix of reverence and fear, the kind only the descendants of silence know when the past refuses to stay buried. Levi paused before the final descent. He scanned the cabin, the crooked stovepipe, the sagging roofline, the dark windows. Still untouched, still waiting. You sure you're ready? Levi asked, his breath misting the air. Elias nodded. He walked this trail with no one but the cold to answer him. Least I can do is walk it with purpose. Silas moved ahead, boots crunching frost-bitten twigs. He'd brought a canvas satchel with soil testing tools, GPS tags, and his ever-present field journal. He'd always said the earth recorded what people forgot. It was just a matter of learning the language. They reached the clearing. The cabin stood quiet, resolute, like a tomb of memory. As Elias stepped forward, he froze. What's that? Levi followed his gaze to the base of the southern wall. Earth had shifted. A sink of soil darkened and damp like something beneath had moved recently. The pine needles above it were scattered, not wind-blown, but disturbed. Wasn't like that when I left, Levi said. Elias crouched and gently brushed the loose earth with his fingers. A sliver of wood protruded a corner of a box, maybe. Not the shape of a root. Something made by hands. I think it's a grave, Elias whispered. Silas knelt beside him. Might be. Or a storage cache. But you don't dig unless you're certain. Levi's breath tightened in his chest. The image of the journal returned Toma's final letter unfinished. Something about the sound under the floorboards. Something scratching. Not here, Levi said. There was another sound. Inside. They entered the cabin. The interior was just as Levi had left it. Sparse, shadowed, infused with a deep quiet. The stove was cold, the quilt still draped over the cot. The floor creaked under their weight. Elias moved with reverence, running his hand along the windowsill, then to the carved initials in the beam T+E+L. Then Levi pointed. There, that board. One plank in the floor near the hearth was shorter than the rest, slightly lifted at one corner. Levi dropped to a knee and pried it loose. Beneath a hollow cavity lined with brittle cloth. Inside it, a small wooden bundle no longer than a forearm, wrapped in what looked like waxed deer hide. No one spoke. Levi lifted it gently. The weight was light. Too light for tools, too heavy for mere keepsakes. He looked to Elias, who nodded once. Levi unwrapped it. Inside was a child's journal smaller than the others, bound in thick cloth edges frayed. And beneath that, wrapped tightly in the hide, lay a scattering of bones. Tiny, fragile, a jawbone no bigger than a spoon, vertebrae like buttons. Elias staggered back a step, hand over his mouth. "It's Toma," Levi said quietly. He never made it out. Silas knelt beside them, solemn. No animal would wrap bones like this. Someone loved him. Elias sank to the floor, holding the cloth-wrapped journal to his chest. He wrote the last entry, he whispered. "I can feel it." He wrote it when he knew he wouldn't make it. They sat in the quiet of that room, each man bowed beneath the weight of history. Eventually, Silas spoke. "We need to take this back. Not just to the council, to the ancestors. This needs ceremony." Levi nodded, but his voice was distant. "There's more." He reached into the cavity again and pulled out another object, a carved bone amulet shaped like a hawk in flight. He turned it over. Etched on the back was the Blacktail family crest, a design long believed lost. Elias held the amulet in trembling hands. "My uncle has this symbol tattooed on his shoulder. Said it was from a dream." "No dream," Silas murmured. Memory passed through blood. They took what they could carry and exited the cabin in silence. Outside, the wind picked up, pulling the mist into coils above the treetops. Then a sudden burst of wind bent the pine boughs hard, sending a whirling scatter of snow and needles across the clearing. A high, thin sound pierced the air, sharp, eerie, like the whistle Levi had heard that first night. He turned, expecting someone behind him. Nothing but trees. But Elias stared into the forest, unmoving. "What is it?" Levi asked. "I saw a shadow," Elias said. It looked like a boy. They watched, the forest eyes wide, but nothing moved again. Just wind and pine and that lingering sound that might have been memory or something older. Silas broke the silence. "We'll return at dawn, with cedar and song. Give him peace." Levi nodded. "And when we do, we bring the story. Every word." As they hiked out of the forest, Levi could feel it, the burden of silence lifting, not all at once, but piece by piece. Truth had roots, and like all things buried, it could only stay hidden so long before the earth itself demanded its telling. The boy had waited a century for someone to finish his last chapter. Now at last, the story was breathing again. And somewhere between the bones and the wind, Levi felt something stir, something old, watchful, and finally at rest. The wind carries more than scent and song. It carries sorrow, memory, and the prayers of those left behind. The sky was slate gray by the time they reached the lodge again. The bundle of bones wrapped with cedar boughs and deer hide sat solemnly in Elias's arms. He walked slowly, reverently, each step deliberate, as if Toma's weight wasn't physical but spiritual, a fragile life held together by silence and finally being given its name. Word had traveled fast across the tribal lands. When Levi, Elias, and Silas reached the main circle, nearly 100 had gathered, elders with braids coiled like wreaths, children gripping their parents' hands, and members of the community holding woven blankets, prayer feathers, and small drums. At the center of the circle stood Laurel, wrapped in her midnight blue shawl, her expression unreadable. She stepped forward as Elias stopped lifting the bundle high enough for the crowd to see. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The story had already begun its second life. Drums began low and slow like a heartbeat. One of the elders, Ahote, stepped into the center with a single flute. Its sound was haunting and hollow, echoing through the cottonwoods with a longing that hadn't been heard in generations. It wasn't a ceremony of mourning. It was a homecoming. Laurel raised her palm and turned to the gathered crowd. "Toma Blacktail," she said, voice steady but thick with feeling. A child hidden by winter, remembered only by the bones and bark. "Today, we bring him home." Silas placed a circle of sweetgrass around the bundle. Cedar smoke trailed through the air, carrying with it the prayers whispered by those who had waited, even without knowing who they were waiting for. Then Elias knelt, placing the bones gently on a cradle board made of birch and sinew. He had carved it himself the night before, guided by memory and instinct, not skill. It was imperfect, but deeply human, like the story it carried. He looked up at the people. His voice broke once before he found his footing. "I didn't grow up knowing this boy's name. My family didn't speak about him, didn't know he was ours. But I hear him now. I read his words, and I promise we won't forget again." A quiet murmur swept through the crowd. Then Levi stepped forward, holding the final piece, Toma's journal. He opened it with trembling hands. "There's one last entry," he said. Scrawled, almost illegible, but it's his. He read slowly, voice raw. "Mama sings to keep the dark out, but Mama stopped singing. I miss her. I think she went to find food. Maybe she found the sun. If someone finds this, my name is Toma. I am not lost. I am waiting." Levi closed the book. There wasn't a dry eye in the circle. One by one, people stepped forward. Some placed beads, others small bundles of tobacco or cornmeal. A young girl left a tiny carved bird. It sat gently atop the hide like a promise that no child would ever be forgotten again. Later that evening, they buried Toma in the ancestral grounds near the river, beside a cherry tree that had grown wide and old with time. The wind shifted as they lowered the cradleboard, carrying the scent of cedar and smoke through the valley. When it was done, Elias remained kneeling long after the last prayer was spoken. Levi sat beside him. "He's home now," Levi said. Elias nodded. "But why did it take so long?" Levi looked toward the mountains. "Because sometimes it takes a stranger with nothing left to lose to dig where others were afraid." "You were never a stranger," Elias said, his eyes wet. "You were always part of this story, even if you didn't know it." The moon rose behind them, full and golden, casting the river in a gentle shimmer. The drums had faded, but the sound still echoed in Levi's bones. Later, back at the lodge, Silas met them with news. "Laurel wants to talk tomorrow. The council's considering designating the Wagon cabin as a heritage site." Elias nodded, still distant. "It deserves to be rebuilt. Not as it was, but as it could have been." Levi added softly, with warmth, with stories, with children's laughter. But as the night deepened and the celebration softened into silence, Levi found himself staring into the fire with unease. There was something left unsaid, unfinished. The forest had given back what was buried, but it hadn't yet spoken about what or who had stayed behind. And in the flicker of the flames, Levi remembered the bone whistle, the sharp sound in the trees, and the shadow Elias thought he saw. Not all spirits wanted peace. Some wanted to be seen, some wanted answers, and some were still watching. Some wounds don't stay buried. They breathe under the floorboards, waiting for footsteps, waiting for justice. Levi stood in the center of the old wagon cabin, his boots coated in ash and dust, the firelight from the lantern casting long, uneven shadows on the log walls. The grave ceremony had brought a quiet kind of peace, but tonight, The silence inside the cabin felt unnatural, compressed, held breath like something was listening. He kneeled beside the hearth again, brushing away years of soot. The floorboard he'd first lifted to find Toma's journal was still slightly ajar. His fingers hesitated, hovering over the edge. He knew there was more, something Laurel hadn't said, something Elias had avoided. He pulled it up. The space beneath the floor held another bundle. This one wrapped, not in hide, but in layers of cloth stained with time. Levi unfolded it carefully, piece by piece, until he revealed a woman's shawl, faded red wool, with Navajo weaving patterns at the edge. Beneath it, a tiny wooden cross, carved from birch, and a handful of blackened, crumbling papers. Letters. He lit another candle, heart drumming. The handwriting matched Toma's, but these words weren't his. They belonged to someone else. If anyone finds this, please understand I didn't leave him. I went for help. I went through snow and thorns and men who said no. I heard him scream. I begged them to come. They wouldn't. They said it was too far, too dangerous. My son was dying, and they said no. So I cursed them. Every one of them. And I waited here under the tree until the birds stopped singing. The last page was smeared with what looked like charcoal and something darker. Levi sat back, breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a mother's letter. It was a testimony. A record of a woman abandoned by her neighbors, her kin, perhaps even by the very tribal authorities who should have helped her. And it wasn't just grief in those words. It was fury. He tucked the bundle under his coat and strode through the trees back to the lodge where Silas and Elias were drinking coffee in the kitchen. The warmth did little to quiet the storm in Levi's chest. "You need to see this," he said, dropping the cloth bundle onto the table. Elias peeled it open slowly, the blood draining from his face. "That's Lena's shawl," he whispered. "Laurel said she disappeared during the blizzard, that she was never found," Levi said. "But this proves she made it to town. She begged for help, and no one came." Silas sat forward, his jaw tightening. There were rumors. Folks said the men at Calhoun's ranch turned her away. She was a woman alone with a starving child and no money. Some said she wasn't worth the risk. Others said she was lying. Levi's voice dropped to a bitter rasp. So they let her walk back into the forest. Let her die. Elias stared at the letters. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a decision. A community decision. "That makes it murder," Silas said. "By omission, by cowardice, doesn't matter. They let her die. Let the boy die." "And someone covered it up," Levi added. "Because the records, the dates, there's no mention of Lena Blacktail ever reaching the ranch." "I checked. Someone erased her." Silas's eyes narrowed. "That ranch still belongs to Thomas Calhoun's grandson, Jacob. He's running for tribal council this winter." Elias stood slowly. "If this gets out—" "It has to," Levi said. "The boy deserves justice. His mother does too. This story isn't just bones and old songs. It's still living, still bleeding." Elias looked haunted. "You don't know what exposing this will do." "I do," Levi said. "It'll tear open wounds, make people uncomfortable, maybe angry. But it'll also make them remember." They agreed to meet Laurel in the morning, but none of them slept that night. Levi lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the forest breathe around him. He couldn't shake the image of Lena Finger's frost-bitten voice, hoarse from screaming, walking through snowdrifts taller than herself, just to beg for a kindness no one offered. When morning came, the sky was heavy with mist. They rode out to the tribal council offices, tucked between the Elder Center and the new community clinic. Laurel met them outside, wrapped in her ceremonial blanket, her expression unreadable. We found something, Elias said, handing her the bundle. She unfolded the letters slowly, fingers reverent, her eyes scanning the fading ink. When she reached the final page, her breath caught. "I always suspected," she said quietly. "My grandmother told me once when she was drunk that not everyone who came for help was turned away because of danger. Some were turned away because of who they were." "You knew Lena?" Levi asked. "I knew her story," Laurel replied. "Or what was left of it. She wasn't from a strong clan. She had no husband. People judged her." Levi clenched his jaw. "That ends now. We bring this to the council. We tell the whole truth." Laurel met his eyes. "Are you ready for what that'll cost? I'm not the one who needs to be," he said. "It's the ones who've kept quiet for generations." She nodded. "Then let's begin." Inside the council chamber was quiet, too quiet. 5 members sat at the long table, some in suits, others in traditional dress. Jacob Calhoun sat third from the left, his gaze cold and still. Laurel opened the meeting, her voice formal. "We bring new evidence concerning the death of Lena Blacktail and her son Toma, whose remains were found last week. We believe this council has a responsibility to review what was done and not done by our predecessors." Elias laid the letters on the table. Levi spoke clearly, recounting what they'd found, what Toma's journal said, and what Lena's words revealed. The room remained still. Then Jacob Calhoun leaned forward. "You're dragging ghosts out of the grave, trying to shame families who had nothing to do with it." "This was a long time ago." Laurel's eyes hardened. "Justice doesn't come with an expiration date." Jacob laughed bitterly. "You really want to destroy what's left of this community over a forgotten child and a woman no one trusted?" "No," Levi said. "I want to rebuild it. But we can't build anything good on lies." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of the elders, Mary Redcloud, stood. "My aunt was the midwife who helped bring Toma into the world," she said, voice trembling. "She said Lena named him after the first bird she heard that spring. Said she wrapped him in songs every night. I remember her. I remember how people talked. It was wrong." She turned to the rest of the council. "This story doesn't shame us. Hiding it does." Jacob stood, slamming his hand on the table. "If you publish those letters, you'll tear this tribe in half." Laurel looked at him without flinching. "Then let it tear. Better that than let it rot." The chamber erupted in murmurs. Outside, the wind picked up. It carried the scent of cedar, but something else too, like smoke just before a storm. Justice had cracked the silence, and nothing would hold back the fire now. He didn't rise from the dead, but in the rustle of leaves, the creak of the trees, and the breaking of silence, Toma lived again. The council chamber had emptied hours ago, but the aftermath lingered like smoke after a fire. Laurel sat beside Levi in the shadow of the council lodge, her back pressed against a support beam, as if she needed its weight to keep her grounded. Elias paced nearby, his movements restless and silent. Silas leaned against the porch railing, arms folded across his chest. The sun had dipped below the mountains, painting the horizon in bands of burning orange. It was a sky fit for endings or beginnings. "They'll push back," Elias said without turning. "Jacob's not done fighting. He's already stirred his supporters into a frenzy. There's talk of removing Laurel from her seat." She expected that, Silas said. "Did it anyway." "Because it was right," Levi added. "It's why we're still here." Laurel exhaled slowly. "Truth's like wildfire out here. Cleans the land, but first it burns everything." She looked at Levi. "You lit it." He didn't reply. He didn't have to. The story had taken on a life of its own. The letters had been published online, then picked up by a regional outlet. Relatives of Lena Blacktail came forward tearful and trembling, admitting they had never known the full story. Some tried to deny the findings, claiming forged documents, a misunderstanding, anything, to hold on to the myth that their people had always done the right thing. But the truth was too heavy to bury again. In the days that followed, offerings began to appear at Toma's grave. Beaded dolls, carved figurines, pages of children's books, a single tin cup filled with sweetened coffee. Strangers sat cross-legged near the cherry tree, whispering apologies to the wind. And at the old wagon cabin, Elias and Silas started to rebuild. The community volunteered, not just from the tribe, but from neighboring towns, retired carpenters, students, and a church group from Flagstaff that had once dismissed the story as a hoax. They arrived carrying tools and pies, their eyes filled with guilt and hope. The cabin was no longer just a ruin in the woods. It was becoming something else, living history. A museum of resilience. But Levi couldn't sit still. He wandered the hills alone more and more often. Sometimes he'd bring a tin of beans and a thermos of strong coffee, sit near the creek, and stare into the wild, listening for a whisper or a cry that never came, and yet he felt it. Something just beyond the trees, watching. One afternoon, as he walked the trail where he'd first seen the rust-colored shawl, he stopped cold. The wind shifted. Pine needles brushed past his face like fingertips. A low moan rose from the trees. Not a coyote, not wind. It was deeper. Human. He followed the sound. Through a stand of oaks blackened by old fires, he came to a hollow he hadn't noticed before. At the center was a mound collapsed, overgrown with moss and tangled roots. Something half buried in the earth glinted in the fading light. Levi crouched and dug carefully. A rusted canteen. A child's carved bird, its head snapped off, and under that a piece of leather hardened with age. Etched into it were names Lena Blacktail, Toma, Hanaya. Levi stared, stunned. Hanaya, he pulled the leather free, revealing another journal. Smaller, water-damaged, but legible. He said my brother died, that Mama left us both. I don't believe him. I heard her cry. I hear her still. There was more. He comes at night. The man with the knife. I hide in the tree roots. Mama told me not to let him find me. I won't. I won't. Levi's hands shook. There had been another child, hidden, forgotten. He returned to the cabin, breathless, heart racing. There's another journal, he said, thrusting it into Elias's hands. There was another child. Elias opened it, eyes wide with disbelief. Hanaya, Toma's sibling. They thought Lena only had one child, Levi said, but she didn't. And this journal, this means someone else was in those woods. Someone alive longer than Toma. Laurel arrived within the hour. When she read the entries, her mouth went dry. There's a record, she said. An old census. A second child. Marked as deceased. But there's no burial, no certificate. Just the word missing. Elias sat heavily on the stoop. Then we didn't just fail one child. We failed two. Laurel's eyes blazed. This isn't just a story anymore. It's a reckoning. That night, the fire burned higher at the cabin. Levi stayed awake, watching the sky pulse with stars. The pine trees whispered above their branches, moving like prayer hands. He couldn't shake the image of Hanaya, small hands covering ears, hiding under frost-covered roots, listening for footsteps that never came. He whispered into the dark, "You're not forgotten. Not anymore." The wind stirred in response, carrying a sound like a sigh, or maybe a promise. The next morning, Laurel issued a public statement. The council would begin an investigation into the missing records, the abandoned search, the death certificates that were never filed. A tribal team of historians and archaeologists was dispatched to the woods. And the cabin, it would remain open. as a place of memory, a place of truth. Elias hammered the final plank into the rebuilt doorway, sweat dripping down his back. Silas painted a sign, the Lodge of Echoes, home of Toma and Hania Blacktail. Underneath, in smaller letters, no one is ever truly lost, only waiting to be found. The ceremony that followed wasn't traditional. It didn't follow a script. Instead, Laurel invited anyone who had a story of loss, of silence, of being turned away, to come forward and speak. One by one, voices rose, grief, anger, confessions whispered like prayers. It wasn't just about the past. It was about healing what the past had broken. And when Levi stepped forward last, holding Hania's journal in both hands, his voice rang steady through the trees. "We thought we came here to rescue the dead," he said. "But maybe they came to rescue us." Behind him the wind stirred again, in the creaking of branches, in the hush of the gathered crowd, in the knowing look Laurel gave to the forest, as if it might answer. Somewhere in the hush of that morning air, two children finally had names, and the silence at last began to lift. The forest doesn't forget even when we do it, holds memory in bark, in stone, in the echo of footsteps long gone. The snow had returned. Soft, drifting flakes settled over the pines like ash after a fire, gentle and solemn. Levi stood beneath the cherry tree, its bare branches creaking in the wind. At its base, two small carved markers had been placed, one for Toma, one for Hania. The wind swept across the ridgeline, stirring his coat and the long prayer tie he'd wrapped around the sapling weeks ago. He closed his eyes and listened. No whispers this time. Just quiet. Deep and full, like the forest had finally exhaled. Behind him the cabin stood complete. Its timbers had been sanded, weatherproofed, and sealed with pine tar. The stones around the fireplace had been relaid, and inside woven mats and handmade quilts made the place feel less like a ruin and more like a cradle. Children from the community now visited with their teachers. Some brought letters, others sketches of the story they had learned, the two siblings, the cabin in the woods, the silence that stretched across decades and finally broke open like spring. Laurel had initiated a cultural restoration fund in Lena Blacktail's name. Survivors of historical trauma came forward to speak at gatherings, each one met with drum circles and fire ceremonies, as if by saying their truths aloud, they too could stitch closed an old wound. And Elias, he had begun carving again. In the evenings when the forest darkened and only firelight flickered in the windows, Elias sat by the hearth and shaped wood into memory. He'd carved a likeness of Toma first, then one of Hania. Then quietly, he made one of Lena. They stood together on the mantel, small as birds eternal, but it was Levi who still walked the woods alone. That morning, with snow in his hair and ache in his chest, he descended the path toward the ravine where he had first found the journal. He knew the trail now, every twist and stone, but still it unsettled him, the way the air shifted as he passed through it, the way time bent underfoot. He reached the hollow again, now ringed with small stones and a protective cedar circle placed by the tribal preservationists. The ground had been thoroughly searched. No more remains had been found, no more journals, no more signs of Hania's final days. But Levi knew something lingered. He knelt, brushing snow from the roots of the old tree. A whisper of wind circled through the hollow, stirring the pine needles. "I didn't come to stir ghosts," he murmured. "I came to find truth." The forest answered only with silence. But then something shifted in the snow, a flicker of white against deeper white. Levi leaned forward. A feather, pure white, tucked in the crook of a root. He picked it up slowly. It wasn't from any bird native to the region, not eagle, not owl. It felt different. sacred. He tucked it into his coat pocket. Back at the cabin, Laurel was waiting with steaming cups of coffee. She handed him one without a word. "They're asking if you'll speak at the gathering next week," she said after a long silence. "I'm not a speaker," Levi said, his voice hoarse. "I'm just the guy who stumbled into this." Laurel sipped slowly. "Exactly why you should speak. You didn't come here to make history. You came here to heal. And that's what people need to see, that healing doesn't begin with perfect people. It begins with the willing." Levi stared into the fire for a long time. "When I first found Toma's bones, I thought it was about uncovering the past. But it was never about just that, was it?" No, Laurel said quietly. "It was about remembering how to see." That evening, Silas arrived with his niece Mariah, a shy girl who had kept to herself during the ceremonies. She approached Levi with hesitation, then handed him a folded drawing. It was a picture of the cabin sketched in careful pencil lines, with the cherry tree in bloom and two children holding hands beneath it. "Toma and Hanaya," she whispered. "They're not alone anymore." Levi crouched and smiled. "No, they're not." The snow fell harder overnight, covering the lodge grounds in a pristine blanket. In the morning, a small ceremony took place at dawn. Elias lit the fire, Laurel smudged the space, and Levi placed the white feather inside a woven basket tied with sinew and painted with the 4 colors of the medicine wheel. "We don't know where Hania's body lies," Levi said, voice strong despite the cold. "But we know where her spirit rests, with her brother. Under this sky, on this land." Laurel raised her hand to the east. "And may no child ever be silenced again." That night, as the fire dwindled and the guests departed, Levi remained alone at the cabin. Snow had piled high along the windowsills, and moonlight shimmered on the porch beams. He sat beside the hearth, staring into the coals. His body ached. His heart was heavy, but full. When the final ember cracked, a faint sound stirred the air. Not the wind, not the trees. A laugh, childlike, fleeting. Then silence again. Levi smiled. Not all stories end with a door slamming shut. Some close, like a song trailing off in the wind. And in that breathless quiet, in that sacred hush, Levi whispered the final words of the story: "You were never lost, just waiting." The fire answered with one last spark. And outside, beyond the cabin's wooden walls, the forest stood, watch vast, ancient, and remembering. The educational lesson learned from this story is that healing can often begin later in life, sparked not by perfect clarity, but by a willingness to listen to others, to memory, and to the land itself. Even deep wounds, long buried, can find peace when truth is unearthed with care and shared with compassion. For those in their later years, it reminds us that the past is not fixed. It's waiting to be understood, honored, and when possible, set free. It's never too late to reconnect with purpose or to help give voice to those who were once silenced.